Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see so many familiar names among the attendance list today. My name is Christina Kepi, and I'm the director of the Center for Canadian American Studies at Western Washington University. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Western Washington University's main campus, we're situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples, who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. And we express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of their shared lands and waterways. Today marks the fourth and second to last presentation of our annual speaker series. This year's series, the theme has been Peoples and Cultures of Canada, and we've been going around various themes that have all touched on identity in some form or fashion. It's been really a pleasurable journey over the past number of weeks. And today we are really excited to bring Dr. Simone Poliandri from the Bridgewater State University. He is a cultural anthropologist specializing in Native American First Nation studies. Simone is also professor of anthropology and director of the American Studies program at BSU, or Bridgewater State University. He holds a PhD from Brown, of all places. Good spot. Simone has conducted ethnographic fieldwork among the Mi'kmaq people of the Canadian Maritimes since 2000. And as a fellow ethnographer, I'm always very excited when I see other people doing ethnographic work. His publications focus on topics including First Nations identity dynamics and nation building, Mi'kmaq residential school experiences, contemporary Aboriginal maritime harvesting, Native American ethnohistory, indigeneity, and social science research methods. Today's talk is titled Aboriginal Identity and Nation Building in the Mi'kmaq. And before I pass or give the floor over to Simone, just want to remind folks that any questions you may have that you would like answered during the Q&A session, please type them into the Q&A feature. That is, the little tab is located on the bottom of your screen. We welcome all your questions and we'll get to as many of them as possible. Recommend that you use the speaker view on Zoom, please. And so I think Simone will be speaking for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have some time for some questions before we wrap up, or a little bit before 5 o'clock. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to our featured guest today, Dr. Simone Poliandri. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. Thank you for being, for the Center for Canadian American Studies at Western Washington University and the Foundation and the alumni for inviting me. Thank you very much for the nice land acknowledgement that you gave. And let me just pull up my slides. Can you see them? You should be able to see them. Let me know if you don't. So my talk is, today I'm going to talk about Aboriginal identity and nation building in the Mi'kmaq First Nations of Nova Scotia. And what I wanted to do in this, about 40 minutes is to, first of all, give an illustration about the Mi'kmaq Nation, the Mi'kmaq people and the Mi'kmaq Nation, people in the East, with a few historical points that have marked the identity, Aboriginal identity, Mi'kmaq identity of the Mi'kmaq people. And then in the second part of the talk, or at least the bulk of the talk, I want to talk about nationhood and nation building, and illustrate how the Mi'kmaq idea, or better ideas, of nation have developed in different social, political, and geographic dimensions, namely three. The tribal dimension, which is the entire Mi'kmaq Nation, the whole Mi'kmaq people as one. The provincial dimension, which is Mi'kmaq people from different provinces of Canada within Mi'kmaq territory. And third, single communities or reserve communities that, they call themselves First Nations singularly. So, but first of all, let me give you some context about the Mi'kmaq. And let me pull up, I have a series of maps and images so you can see them. well. So this is a map of Canada, and you can see in this map, the red circle indicates Mi'kmaq territory. So the Mi'kmaq people are an indigenous population of the eastern, Canada and northeastern United States. Again, they have been here before the border was ever conceived, and they have been in this area, according to their oral narratives, since time immemorial. Archaeologically speaking, the evidence of Mi'kmaq presence or indigenous presence in the area dates back to about 11,000 years or so, and so for a long time, and this is a map of Mi'kma'ki. Mi'kma'ki is the name that the Mi'kmaq people give to their territory, and their traditional territory is divided in different districts, and you can see them here. From I guess Begewak, Last Land on the left, to Unama'ki, Land of Fog, and others, and so they are all named. And these were traditional districts that today have no longer administrative and legal significance, but they still have cultural, significance. In fact, district chiefs still exist. They have more of a representative function today, as they have been superseded by the, chief and council, the Indian Act chief and council system. But still, the subdivision of Mi'kma'ki in traditional districts has, again, as I said, a cultural and therefore an identity component in the lives of Mi'kmaq people. The Mi'kmaq people have been, since pre-contact times, have been a nomadic people in this area. So have been traveled, usually scattering the summer along different, routes and rivers and bays and land, and going to harvesting territories, usually in the spring and summer, early fall, and then clustering in winter villages, for the winter, and they've done it for a long time. They in part, as I'll show in a second, they still do it for different reasons, but they still do it. They still travel and use, let's use the word, use the territory in this way. Colonially speaking, after contact, they were, the French were in this area first, and then the British came, and the French were based in the whole, mostly the whole province of Nova Scotia, and then they were pushed up to Unama'ki in this Cape Breton area here, where they remained, and the British, occupied the rest of this province and also New Brunswick. And again, the French and the British were fighting, fought colonial wars, and so the Mi'kmaq people were kind of in between these colonial wars, and they sided with for the French, with the French. That's one of the reasons why the Mi'kmaq are Catholic, or at least a majority of the Mi'kmaq are Catholic and not Protestant. And in fact, the French were savvy or astute enough to use Catholicism as a way to as a weapon against the British, Protestantism and invasion. Interesting story that I can tell you, true story. When I was, I spent time in Namagi in several reserves, including Eskasoni, which is right here, and I'll show it in a later map. And I was staying with a friend, Mi'kmaq friend, in one of the communities. And so this is a friend who's been in residential school, had suffered as a very strong anti. He used to say, that's his word, anti-white. And so I talked about white people here, white people there. And I told him, but I'm staying with you in your house, and I'm a white person. So what do you, how do how do you reconcile with that? I said, well, you're Italian. I'm from Rome, Italy originally. I said, you're not white, you're Italian. And I said, what do you mean by that? I said, for us, white people are British people. People who wanted to come here and take our land. And so that really gave me an idea of the idea that people have of, again, colonial dispossession and colonial history in terms of who's who and who did what. As I said, Catholicism has been present in Mi'kmaq territory for 400 years, but of course today there several people who also practice traditional spirituality, either Mi'kmaq traditional spirituality, praying in sweat lodges with the Eastern Door, with the black pipe. But there are also some Mi'kmaq people who have adopted other, native spiritual forms of spiritualities, namely the Sundance, for example, from South Dakota and Saskatchewan. And so they pray with sweat lodges with the southern door, western door, and they play with the red pipe and they Sundance. And so they're a blend of different, spiritual traditions that blend with, again, with Catholicism to create an interesting form of syncretism where there's, people are fully Catholic, people are fully traditional, and everything in between. An important date in the history of all Aboriginal peoples of Canada is 1876, the creation of Indian Act, by which the newly country of Canada, which has been formed about 10 years before, regulated all Indian affairs. And of course, that changed a lot of things. The Indian Act was also updated, revised several times, over the decades until very recently. This is a map of the Mi'kmaq territory with the national and provincial, national boundaries, United States and Canada, and also the provincial boundaries. And it has also the Mi'kmaq communities you can see here, and actually drew here Newfoundland and Conne River because it didn't fit in the map. And you can see they're, spread out, in Nova Scotia, in New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island. There's one community here. There's also a landless, large band in Newfoundland. They're also in Quebec, in Eastern Quebec, and there's also one community in Maine, in the United States, so across, the border, United States and Canada border. What I focused on my research, I went all over the Maritimes, of course, but I focused mostly on Nova Scotia, on Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. And a couple of important developments in the 20th century that defined Mi'kmaq life and affected actually Mi'kmaq life heavily were, first of all, centralization. In the 1940s and 1950s, the government of Canada wanted to streamline and simplify the services given to Mi'kmaq and Indigenous communities, and Mi'kmaq communities in this case, and who live mostly in rural areas. Of course, the reserves were in rural areas, and so servicing them and actually reaching them was complicated. And so they enacted this, ill-fated policy of centralization by which all Mi'kmaq people were supposed to, the idea was to centralize them in two large communities, Sibeganagadik here and Eskasoni here. So one in the central part of Nova Scotia, one in the northern part of Nova Scotia. And there were many people who were actually forced to leave their other communities to centralize, to go to one of these communities, according to the ones that were closer to. And several people, including people that I know personally, they had their house burned, for example, after they left. They burned their house so to make sure they didn't return. I remember a story of this very nice lady who unfortunately passed away. She was in her 80s, and I was there when I was there about 20 years ago. She grew up. She was born and grew up in Bear River, down here in southwestern Nova Scotia, but she was centralized to Sibeganagadik in the late 1940s, and she grew up there. She had children there, and she lived all their life there on the reserve. But she was given at the end, towards the end of her life, when she was in the early 80s, she was given a house finally on Bear River, and so she returned. And actually, I was the one who she asked me, because I had a car, and she asked me if I could drive her back, do the drive from Sibeganagadik to Bear River to move her back home. And she said, I'm going back home after 70 years, 65 years. And so I remember doing that and driving her there, and then she spent the last few years of her life in Bear River, back home again. So that was centralization. Another important and painful part of the event in the history, 20th century history of the Mi'kmaq, was the residential school. There was only one residential school located in eastern Canada, located near the community of Sibeganagadi, right here. And the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School was opened between 1929 and 1967 near the village of Shubenacadie, Nova Scotia, which was at the time near the Indian Brook Reserve. Indian Brook was the name that the community had. It's been recently changed into, or they renamed it or named it back to the original Sibeganagadi. And this is where more than 2,000 Mi'kmaq children from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Quebec were forced to go. And you may, of course, have heard about residential schooling in the Canada and the United States, where there were abuse and there were beatings, there were forced acculturation and for stripping of culture, of visual, emotional, and all kinds of signs of indigenousness had to be removed, of course. As far as, there are records, there were no instances or it's no instances of sexual abuse at the Shubang Indian Residential School, but this happened in other, residential schools, across Canada and the United States. Nevertheless, this was a very painful and intergenerational, event that happened to the Mi'kmaq people. In fact, several generations went to residential school and carried the burden of this until today. Still, there are today survivors. They call themselves survivors of the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School. We're dealing with the pain and the memories and the abuse and the trauma of and the post-trauma stress disorder of having attended the residential school or having one of the family members attend the residential school and then indirectly being affected by all the quote-unquote garbage. There was a term that a survivor, a very good friend of mine, survivor, all the garbage that we brought back home from there, we actually dumped it on our family members and friends and people around us, because of course that's how we grew up. And this is a map of the community of the Indian Brook, or now Sibeganagadi Reserve. It's located here near the village of Shubenacadie along Highway 102 in central Nova Scotia. And the school was located right here, the Shubenacadie Indian Residential School, which is about 5-6 miles from the reserve. So pretty close. And this is a photograph of the school when it was open. The left side here was the boys' side, and the girls' side on the right side. So they were separated by gender and by age according to floor, and then in the center there were classrooms and administrative offices. Another photograph, of the school, and many people, actually, people looking at this photo, they always said that it looks like a prison. It's like so. It's all this heavy brick, strong, and then all these almost daunting building. This is a photograph of during the school, Father Brown and the Mi'kmaq children. And again, you can see in this photo, separated by gender with uniforms and haircuts, and this was, and nuns, Sister of Charity nuns in the back, and there are many accounts, including probably the most notable ones, Isabel Knockwood, who's unfortunately she passed a few years ago, and she was a survivor and wrote this very interesting and very revealing book called Out of the Depths. And she mentioned how this photo mask, showed this, very pleasant, it's like a school photo with all the kids in uniform, well dressed, and so forth. But this, of course, hid or masked the atrocities that happen behind the walls when the camera was not there. A couple of quotes from this woman that I use a pseudonym called Regina, who's a survivor, and she told me directly when I interviewed her, she told me Catholicism was beaten into us in the residential school, and she also said at the residential school you are sent to be taught love, honor, and obey. The honor and obey were beaten into us. Love we did not know anything about. And so this is what she said. Um, this is a photo from school. So there were, activities like, to use the alphabet and numbers, and kids were, learning to introduce themselves and, regular schoolwork. This is another photo that shows the laboratory when they made crafts and pottery, for example. Interesting about this photo, and again, when I spoke to Isabel, she said, that looks cool right there. That looks great that we're doing pots, but notice one thing: all those pots on the shelf in the back there, we were not allowed to bring our pots home ever. So even we asked, they say, no, you can't. Those don't belong to you, belong to the school. And so we could never, when you're a kid and you're proud of what you've done and you want to show it to your parents, and sometimes kids were allowed to go home for the holidays, for example, but they could never bring back their pots, and so they could never be given, satisfaction for their work. So that was a way in which, even in this allegedly normal activities of school, kids were still punished. And of course, there are plenty of uh, stories and memories of abuse, of beatings, of people being strapped and so forth. The school eventually burned down closed in 67, but the building remained standing until 1986, when it burned down, and nobody knows who set it on fire. And on June 11, 2008, the former premier of Canada, Stephen Harper, offered an official apology on behalf of Canada to all residential school survivors and families. And there was also a rebuttal by the former chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Phil Fontaine. And this also or at least led to the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was a commission that was mandated, tasked to collect testimonies and look through and sift through all these, and came out in 2015 with a report, and made 94 recommendations called Call to Actions on things that the government should do in order to try to fix or to mend and reconcile with the Indigenous peoples. And again, this is still a work in progress. So this has been very important. One of the reasons why I say this is that when you talk to people who went to residential school, probably the first thing they tell you, how they introduce themselves: my name is, such and such, I'm a survivor. That's the first thing they say of themselves: I'm a survivor of the residential school. That comes before anything else. And so having experienced directly or indirectly residential school has affected people's identities in a very profound way. And that's why, it is important also to remember. In July 2020, following the dedicated lobbying by several Mi'kmaq survivors and institutions, Parks Canada, which is the government office that oversees the establishment and maintenance of national historic sites, designated the location of the former school as a national historic site. Today, as you can see, this is a photo that I took, actually. The school used to stand where the blue building. Now it hosts a plastic molding facility. And there were 3 commemorative plaques that were placed here and unveiled before an audience of survivors, of descendants, and Mi'kmaq officials and community members. And this was officially done on September 30, 2021. And this is a close-up of one of the plaques, again, that remembers this as a National Historic Site and the one important location in the history of the Mi'kmaq people. Another important element in post-contact history of the Mi'kmaq were the treaties of peace and friendship, something that affects still the lives of Native Mi'kmaq people today. Treaty of 1725 and 26, so peace made with British in exchange for non-interfering with the hunt, fish, and farming of Native people. The Treaty of 1752, again with the British Crown, peace was made in exchange for hunting rights to hunt, fish, and trading so that native Mi'kmaq people, native people in the area could hunt, fish, and trade, trading rights. And the Treaty of 1760 and 61 is a series of treaties that uh, gave the native people in exchange for peace the right to make a moderate livelihood by hunting, fishing, and gathering in the area. And these treaties are still valid, and they have been actually at the forefront of several, land claims and claims to resources, access to resources in the area, including court cases in recent times. One of those notable examples is the story of Donald Marshall Jr., photographed here. Junior Marshall he passed away a few years ago. He was a Mi'kmaq individual, the son actually of former Grand Chief of the Mi'kmaq Nation, Donald Marshall Sr. And when he was a teenager in 1971, he was arrested. Donald Marshall Jr. was arrested and convicted for murder that he did not commit and spent 11 years in prison. And after that, he was released, and his story, among others, including the Oka crisis of 1990 among the Mohawk, triggered a process that led to the 1996 Royal, Commission on Aboriginal Affairs by the British Crown. Following that, in 1993, Donald Marshall Jr. was arrested and charged for selling $790 Canadian dollars of eel without a license. And again, he was making a living, very modest living as a fisherman, being a skilled fisherman, and he was arrested. And he said, in response to that, I can do this. I'm a Mi'kmaq person. I have a treaty that dates back to 1760 that allows me to hunt and fish without a license. And so these went to court, and he lost in court in 1996. The first round, ruled against him. He appealed in 1997. He lost in appeal, but in 1999, the Supreme Court of Canada reversed the decision of the appeal court and actually ruled in favor of Marshall. That was a historic, a landmark, an historic decision that actually opened up many possibilities. It also opened up the proverbial can of worms, because immediately, the many commercial, not only the government of Canada, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, that manages all the fisheries, for example, again, Parks Canada, but also the industry. They were nervous in terms of these people are going to go out and hunt and fish without licenses, without seasons, without permits, without regulations, and so forth. And in fact, there were episodes of violence that happened right after that. And as a result, in an unprecedented move, 2 months later, on November 17th, the Supreme Court issued a clarification to its original ruling, saying that the Mi'kmaq people have or the Marshal, was right. The Mi'kmaq people have the right to fish, according to the treaties, but the government will regulate, also will be present and have a voice in regulating the fisheries, which was a way to sort of curtail or dampen a little bit the initial decision. Nevertheless, again, these opened up a lot of possibilities. And so there were communities like Siberekanagadi here down in St. Mary's Bay and Burn Church here in the Miramichi Bay that went out and fished, did lobster fishing. And lobster fishing is very lucrative. In the summer of 2000, right after, they were the only two communities that fished. All other communities had made, have stricken interim deals with the government in exchange for fishing according to governmental, seasons and regulations. They were given, equipment, training, money, boats, and so forth. But two communities, again, Sibeganagadi and Burn Church here, refused to sign an interim deal, and instead they say, we have a treaty, we can go fishing, and so they did. And that was my first time in Canada when I started to do research, the beginning of my research here in St. Mary's Bay. I spent a summer there. And it was very interesting because it was every day there were, police raids and DFO raids and monitoring and arrest and so forth. Again, this was just a bunch of small fishermen on a wharf, but it was really a struggle for power. And This also, interestingly, again, people of Sibeganagari fished here, which mirrors, in a way, the traditional nomadic lifestyle of the Mi'kmaq, who again traveled to different locations to go to harvesting, territory. The fishery restarted, once, kind of. Went down in 2000. It restarted 20 years later in fall of 2020, and there was another series of accidents here. You can see the commercial fishermen unhappy. They destroyed the Mi'kmaq people's catch. There were some torching of some vehicles and boats, and the police intervened. And this was again here in southwest Nova Scotia. And here you can see the former chief of Sibeganagari, Mike Sack, who's addressing the crowd again, something that has remained part of the lives of the Mi'kmaq until today. And so all these issues, all these events are part of the recent history of the Mi'kmaq Nation. And in recent times, First Nationhood and First Nationalism, these are the terms that I used to define and to highlight the peculiarity of Indigenous expressions of nationhood, nationalism, have characterized the political, social, and cultural actions of many Native communities in Canada and the United States. And nationhood represents one of the newest frontiers where the Indigenous peoples of North America have been searching for sources of self-determination. And actually, the use of the frontier image, and the pun here is very much intended. The frontier is one of the strongest ideological and territorial elements of colonialism in North America. And in this context, the use of the term aims purposely at highlighting the virtual inversion of the colonial march, whereby Native peoples are now pushing back in the ever-growing attempts to regain their rights to self-define, self-identify, and self-rule. And nation building embodies one of the strongest attempts to achieve these goals in the 21st century. And so nationhood and nation building are undoubtedly grounded on territory. Yet, and I argue here in the second part of this talk, among the Mi'kmaq people, the extent of such territorial base is different according to whether the idea of nation is expressed in economic, legal, administrative, social, or cultural terms. And I call these contextual nationhood. So nationhood is different, or the idea of nation and the dimension of nation is different in different contexts. So I have a few slides where I'm going to talk about these different dimensions of nationhood, three of them: the tribal dimension of nationhood, the community dimension of nationhood, and the provincial dimension of nationhood. Starting with the first one, the tribal dimension of nationhood. So nation, the idea of nation for the Mi'kmaq people, one way in which they look at nation is the entire Mi'kmaq, the entire territory of Mi'kmaq. You see the map in the background. So all Mi'kmaq is one nation. And this is mostly a social and cultural dimension of nation. And I want to illustrate this by using two examples, the Mi'kmaq powwow circuit and the annual celebration of Saint Anne. Saint Anne is the patron saint of the Mi'kmaq. As I said, Catholicism remained strong for 400 years. And these two elements, the powwow circuit and the celebration for Saint Anne's on July 26th every year, they portray Mi'kmaq nationhood as a sentiment that glues people throughout the entire Mi'kmaq territory. This is a photograph of a page, actually just came out of on the Mi'kmaq Maliseet Nations News, which is the monthly publication of the Mi'kmaq and the Maliseet nations in this area, that shows the powwow trail. This is upcoming, so if you're interested in going to a powwow, it is from June to September. Different communities across the entire Maritimes, even the one in Maine, actually across into the United States, they host powwows. And so there are people who travel, Mi'kmaq people who travel, the powwow trail. And they take, usually the powwows, they take place over weekends, from Saturday and Sunday or Friday, Saturday and Sunday, according to the community. And so people travel and they they go and stay with friends or family that live in other communities. I travel myself when I was living there with Mi'kmaq friends, and we went to different powwows, and so there's a network of relationship that sort of gets renewed because people visit people they haven't seen for many months or since a year before. They take the opportunity to stay with friends and family and so forth, and that actually again reinforces and renews this network. Interestingly, this is a photo I took of the one of the powwows, the arbor where the drummers are hosted, and they put several flags, including the Canadian flag, the Mi'kmaq flag, the Nova Scotia flag, and here on this side there was the United States flag, and this a close up of the Mi'kmaq flag on the bottom here, and the Canadian flag. It's interesting that they put these flags, side by side on the same uh, level, again, to mark the nation-to-nation relationship between the Mi'kmaq and Canada and the United States. Again, these are the photographs that I took of the powwow, where people from different communities go and enjoy themselves. They eat, Mi'kmaq tacos, and they camp. You can see, the trailers, and so they really, again, renew this nomadic, lifestyle. At least in the summer. So this marking and this using, as I said before, the territory and networking across the territory. The other element that marks this one nation is the St. Anne's Day celebration of July 26th. It's patron saint of the Mi'kmaq every year, July 26th, and actually for an entire week, communities celebrate St. Anne. There's a main celebration here on Chapel Island in northern Nova Scotia, where there's a mission that lasts for a week, and you can see all these shacks and Mi'kmaq people own shacks, and they reside here. There's a central church, and they have rosaries and prayers, and there are processions, every day. But also other communities, like this was in Sibedaganagadik, they have processions, mass, and those celebrate St. Anne. And again, this is something that's done across the entire Mi'kmaq nation at the same time. And there are several people who go to other communities to celebrate St. Anne, again, with their family. Maybe they're from another reserve, and so they go back home to celebrate St. Anne, or they go to the mission on Chapel Island because they own a cabin, and so they reconnect with Mi'kmaq people from other places. And this is another way in which Mi'kmaq people from the entire Mi'kmaq again remain connected, on a single, for a single event, for a single purpose. This is a quote from the one of the official publication of the one of the tribal organization that's talking about the historical background. The Mi'kmaq says the Mi'kmaq nation has lived and occupied the area now known as the Atlantic provinces and the southern Gaspe Bay Peninsula since time immemorial. This area is known to the Mi'kmaq people as Mi'kma'ki. So the Mi'kmaq nation, again, talking about the Mi'kmaq nation, one nation. So this, as I said, is mostly a social and cultural dimension. And this map represents it very well. In fact, let's move to the second dimension of Mi'kmaq nation, the community dimension. At the same time, single communities, like Sibeganagadik, some of which are very small, they singularly call themselves First Nation, the Sibenagadis First Nation, the Millbrook First Nation. And this is mostly an administrative and economic dimension of nationhood, as different communities have different needs, economic needs. Of course, economic development is different in different communities. They also have administrative needs that are different according to their membership, where they're located, rules and regulations and so forth. And so they act as a unit, right? For example, this is the Eskasoni First Nation, and at the entrance of when you drive along this coastal road, you see this sign, "Welcome to Eskasoni First Nation, the largest Mi'kmaq reserve in the world." So when you cross this, two-lane coastal road and you pass this sign, you are crossing. You look at the sign, you're crossing a national boundary. You're not just entering a reserve, you're crossing a national boundary. And again, that's a form of empowerment for the Mi'kmaq people to have this dimension of nationhood. Another example, Sibeganagadik community. This is within the community they erected near the cemetery in the center of the reserve these flagpoles, and you can see the United States flag, the Sibeganagadik flag, the flag of only this community, the Sibeganagadik Nation, and the Canadian flag. Again, on the same level, you have the United States, Canada, and the community of Sibeganagadik, which has about 2,000 people. And this is a close-up of the flag with the moose, antlers, and the fish, representing the resources of the land, the 13 Mi'kmaq communities, 13 dots, the 8-point star, and the Treaty of 1752. Really put right there on the flag, just to remember, and then everybody, the government and everybody, that the treaties are still here and they're permanently on our flag. And each First Nation is part of the Assembly of First Nations, the umbrella organization in Canada that hosts, that represents more than 600 First Nations and more than 900,000 Indigenous individuals. A couple of quotes from people that I talked to. Again, the Mi'kmaq man, a middle-aged man that I call Daniel, this is a pseudonym. He said, "In my mind, I see us Mi'kmaq people as a nation in unity, equality, and fairness. In reality, I only see groups of nationhoods, small clusters in each community. Each community has its own needs." And so again, the idea that even, people see these smaller dimension of nationhood, the single community. Anna, another pseudonym, told me that the government made each band a First Nation rather than the whole Mi'kmaq population under one Mi'kmaq nation. This divides the people, and the government has always looked for that. So she's also dissenting this idea of, division. Finally, Jean, another, middle-aged Mi'kmaq woman, and this is a pseudonym again, she said, "I know so many people in every reserve, and I have relatives everywhere. I can go visit and stay. I'm not too fond of going to a non-native community and stay, but I feel comfortable going to a native community. When you're native and go to a non-native community, they look at you funny because you don't belong there," which is interesting. In fact, she gave me a fantastic vision, sad but fantastic, but interesting. She said, look at Nova Scotia and look at all these our communities. I wish we had one of those, monorail, those fast monorails that travel above the land and connect all our communities, and so we can bypass everything that has been in between. There's all this no-native land that I'm just interested in going from station to station, from First Nation to First Nation, which again is this perspective of single First Nations, again in a sea of no-native land surrounding them. Finally, the provincial dimension of Mi'kmaq nationality. This, last part of my talk. The most recent dimension of Mi'kmaq nationality is the provincial one, where Mi'kmaq community from one province, they work together, and this is mostly a political, legal, and administrative dimension of nationhood. So all First Nations in one province join forces together to negotiate, to deal with the provincial government and the federal government and any other, either business or even United Nations, for example. But they act as, a provincial nation. More recently, it has also become an economic dimension of nation. All the communities from single provinces has started to also to do business together as one, so as a cooperative, if you allow me this term. And so in this case, Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq, you can see the 13 communities of Nova Scotia, they join together, and the chiefs of the 13 community are joined in an organization called the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chiefs. And they have started in 2002 the Made in Nova Scotia process, which is a table of negotiation that puts together the Assembly of Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq Chief, the 13 chiefs of the 13 communities acting as one, the government of Nova Scotia, and the government of Canada. It's tripartite forum is a existing forum where the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia sort of deal and negotiate as a unit with Nova Scotia and Canada. And they are represented at this table by KMKNO, which is Kilmuk Mak Luzwang, which means we are seeking consensus, which is an organization that represents the Mi'kmaq chiefs at the table of negotiation. One of the reasons why this is done, it was actually Victor, a Mi'kmaq official. His name is a pseudonym, but he worked for the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs. And he said, dealing with just Nova Scotia for us is easier and more effective than dealing with several provinces altogether. And he said, this is because, for example, in Nova Scotia, we're very efficient. Our chiefs are very efficient in dealing with our staff, with our paperwork, with our administrative staff. And so we are very quick at getting to a point in the negotiation. But if we're doing negotiation together with all the other Mi'kmaq from New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island and other provinces, we have to wait for them to be done in their provinces. Plus, governments of different provinces may be different. So we may have a liberal government here in Nova Scotia and a conservative in New Brunswick. So we may have a different dynamic. So while we're waiting here for them to be done, but times is passing. And so it's extremely clunky. And so working only in one province, it allows us to really speed up and streamline a lot of the processes and a lot of the development that we want to do, including, again, legal, treaty negotiations, and also economic development. On October 1st, 2008, the Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia actually issued a nationhood proclamation, and this is actually the photograph of the actual proclamation, both in Mi'kmaq on the left and in English. And one of the passages, I'm going to read them here, says, the chiefs of Nova Scotia hereby come together to proclaim and assert nationhood of the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia. Nationhood of the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia over our traditional lands and waters. So they proclaim, they give reality to the idea that there's a Mi'kmaq nation in Nova Scotia and only in Nova Scotia. Again, a quote from Mark, a Mi'kmaq individual, middle-aged, said, when I think of Mi'kmaq nation, I think of all Mi'kmaqi. It's only in the past couple of decades that we started to think only about Nova Scotia. This is the work that the chiefs are doing. Again, there's a recognition from community members that this provincial dimension of nation is actually it's happening, and it's where we're going. It's our direction. A couple of communities, this is still a work in progress, so it requires some adjustments, some learning curves. So a couple of communities, Sibeganagadi and Millbrook, left the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs, and I marked a couple of passages. I'm not going to read them for the sake of time, but basically saying that Millbrook decides to leave the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs and do negotiation on its own. Sibeganagadi follows suit. But later on, by late 17, early 18, they were back into 13 communities. They realized that actually working as a provincial unit works very well. And so they've been back. And there are, a couple of examples to conclude of things that have been happening very recently. On December 10, 2025, just a couple of months ago in Halifax, the Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq and Parks Canada signed the Toki Maliapmuk arrangement, which means we will look after it together, which is an arrangement that whereby the Nova Scotia Mi'kmaq and Parks Canada agreed to co-manage, crown lands in Nova Scotia that have cultural and social significance for the Mi'kmaq. So there's a big, it's a big deal for the Mi'kmaq people who get, decisional control and decisional power on co-managing lands that are, across the province that are crown owned and have some kind of, cultural or social significance for the Mi'kmaq. Chief Sidney Peters of the Gluskap Mi'kmaq First Nation, in representation of the Mi'kmaq, said, "This arrangement is the first of its kind for the Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia. It strengthens our role in helping to oversee national parks and national historic sites, protects our Mi'kmaq rights, and ensures that the Mi'kmaq voice is part of decision-making on these lands going forward. It demonstrates how we can create nation-to-nation arrangements where the Mi'kmaq can truly work alongside the federal government as equal partners." And the Honorable Julie de Brusin, the Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Nature of Canada, said, "On behalf of the Government of Canada, I'm honored to assign this arrangement, which represents a tangible commitment to supporting the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia in the stewardship of their lands and waters, including area parks Canada administers." Another thing, and this is my last example, just really a few weeks ago, the Mi'kmaq Nova Scotia, the Assembly of Mi'kmaq Chiefs, together as a unit, they purchased some land in Bedford, Nova Scotia, right here. And this is a Google Maps screenshot where, nearby the Bedford Petroglyph National Historic Site, which hosts some Mi'kmaq, very old petroglyphs. And so they purchased this land here, this forested land here. It's about 40 acres to protect it, the petroglyph site from further development. You can see near Halifax. And so they were afraid that this would be developed, maybe an industrial park or something like that. And so they decided to purchase it in order to prevent actual development. And this is also another thing that the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia have done as a unit. Again, another example of the collective effort of the Mi'kmaq people. A quote by Chief Leroy Denny of Eskasoni, in representation of the Mi'kmaq chief, says, "We all know how important it was for the Mi'kmaq Nation that we acquired these lands to safeguard Mi'kmaq cultural heritage and honor the relationship we have had with the land since time immemorial." Again, the Mi'kmaq of Nova Scotia. So, in conclusion, and this is my last slide, I've shown in this presentation how there are different dimensions of the Mi'kmaq people, how the Mi'kmaq people use to conceive of the idea of nation. One nation, Mi'kma'ki, single communities also as a nation, and the provincial dimension of nation. And the importance of the development of these different dimensions of nationhood lies in the potential to shape inter and intra-community relations for years to come for the Mi'kmaq people, and comparatively for other Native First Nations who face or will face similar opportunities and challenges. Thank you, Welaliok, and I'm now open for questions. I'll stop here. And I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Simone. That was absolutely fascinating. I loved every moment of it. And I know that there are units here on campus who they had wanted to come today, but they were unable to attend at this time. And so they're like, can we get the recording? So there will be a recording available on our website at some point soon in the next couple of days. So those who, if there are more questions coming in, please feel free to put them in the Q&A. I've seen a few here for you, and I'm just going to summarize them for you. And one is quite direct and easy. They're wondering if you could explain the meaning behind the Mi'kma'ki flag.
The Mi'kmaq flag, well, do you want me to bring it up or? Sure. Right here, let me see if I can find it in this. I'm gonna go to to this one here. So this is a Mi'kmaq flag, and you can see here the cross. Again, it has the Catholic tradition. Again, when I talk to some people, it's interesting how you ask two different people and they give you two different answers, and they tell you listen to me, I know what's right, and then you ask another person and say it's mine. And so some people said, our real tradition is Catholicism. It's been with us for 400 years. Whereas if you ask some traditional people, say, well, don't listen to them. Catholicism is foreign. But nevertheless, Catholicism has been present for, 400 years uninterrupted. And so it is ported in the Mi'kmaq flag. The star and the moon stand for the resources of the land and for the elders. Very quickly, so.
Okay. Another question that's come in over Q&A is, How prevalent is what you say about the Maritimes to the rest of Canada in the sense of nationhood? Are you able to make any comparisons, or maybe even to the U.S., with other Indigenous nations?
For the um well, definitely yes. One of the things that is common to many, for example, the Mohawk, is there's a very strong sense of nationhood to begin with. So the idea we are a nation, we're not an ethnic group, we're not a minority, we are a nation. Again, this idea of nation to nation. Then how it's actualized in terms of again treaty rights or negotiations with the government that when things become may become more complicated, but definitely there's at least comparatively there's this very strong of nation in both in the US and Canada.
Thank you. Coming back to flags, you had a slide where you had the Canadian flag, the Mi'kmaq flag, and the US flag. They're all sort of at the same level. Is there anything that you have noticed, and here I'm summarizing here, of how you see the Mi'kmaq people identify themselves? Are they first Mi'kmaq, and then Canadian? How does that work? And is that reflected sort of in the flags?
That is an amazing question. If you have a couple hours, I'll keep it, but in a couple of minutes, let me summarize it. Uh, Interestingly, there are different layers. People see themselves as, depending on where they are, the context where they are. Of course, among other Mi'kmaq people, they are from a particular family or from a particular community. When I travel with Mi'kmaq people to South Dakota, for example, they are indigenous, of course, because they are in the presence of our indigenous people, or the Mi'kmaq people themselves. They have traveled and worked in Maine, in the blueberry, field, raking blueberries in Maine, or picking potatoes, or working in Boston, and so they are in contact with many indigenous, other indigenous peoples, though they're indigenous to begin with. Uh, Depending on the interesting one of the things that several Mi'kmaq young men have done is to serve in the United States Marines, not the Canadian Army, for example. That's kind of a form of, I don't want to say resistance, but of course, because they've lived in Canada. I don't know if they have lived, for those who have lived in the US, they would, think otherwise. So there is this sense that they are Mi'kmaq first, and Indigenous first, and then Canadian or from the United States. Also, the fact that, according to the Jay Treaty, which is 1794 treaty, that United States recognized but Canada does not. Indigenous people, Mi'kmaq people can travel across the border without documents. We can live and work across the border. This has changed after September 11 with the, kind of a, now, when you travel, we have to basically strip naked and they, million controls, passports and everything. And so it also happened for the Native peoples. But again, they still see themselves as first of a land that has the border is just an impediment, is not ours. Many people see it this way.
We're gonna have just one last question and see if it see how quickly you can answer this one. Um, and this again, I'm sort of like summarizing all of this from what I've read here in the chat. Is that there was a quote about not being comfortable in a non-native community, but being comfortable in a native community. As an ethnographer, how did you overcome that going into the community?
Myself, reversed. Well, I have to say,
Mhm.
like, I have it takes, it's part of, it's part of the getting used to getting people getting used to myself being truthful of what I was doing. I cook for everybody, Italian food. People appreciated that. I developed personal relations. Not everybody welcomed me. Most people did. Some people didn't, and it was okay. It's part of it. But again, it takes time to trust, to gain trust. So that's part of, again, and it's not 100% perfect. It will not work for everybody, but for most of the people, it did work. In fact, I have to say that maybe the personal experience have been even more rewarding than the professional one. Still, I have plenty of friends there that I'm in contact with. When I go there, visit, I play music with an artist, and when we go there, we make sure that we play together. So, again, I have wonderful personal relations, again, based on trust and respect and honesty to tell, really.
It's amazing what trust and respect and honesty can do in the world. It's wonderful.
right? If
Yeah.
only.
Well, I think that unfortunately is all the time we have for today. So before everyone leaves, I just want to announce that in 2 weeks we're going to have our last presenter, and this is going to be Jeff Reichfeld from the University of Guelph, the School of Environmental Design and Rural Development. He's a doctoral candidate there, and he will be speaking on the relationship between Canada's farming cultures and sustainability. So that's going to be a wonderful way to sort of close out this annual speaker series. So, Simone, thank you so much for joining us, and it's lovely to see you again. And I'm very, very thankful and grateful that you've been sharing your expertise with us. And everyone who joined us today, thank you so much for your constant support of the center. We really appreciate it, and also want to acknowledge the Foundation for Western Alumni for always helping us out and being behind the scenes. So be prepared to see a recording pop up in your inbox here in the next couple of days, and then an invite to our next presentation in 2 weeks' time, same place. So thank you again, Simone. It's lovely to see you, and have a wonderful rest of your day out there in the snow, way out there
Well,
on the East
thank
Coast.
you, Christine. I want to thank Western Washington and all our viewers here. It was a pleasure for me, and back to shoveling.
Thank you.